This is the hardest part of your job as a pastor, preaching week in and week out. And one of the things, I think this is one of the areas where we bring the highest set of expectations in with us from other places to Utah. Everybody has a pastoral model, people that they've looked to and would want to emulate. And I think one of the most important things that you can do here in Utah is you've got to find your own voice. And you've got to do this. You've got to preach in a way that is consistent with who you are as an individual. You have to preach with authenticity, but you also have to preach in a way that reaches out to the culture. And in the end, the results have got to be left to Jesus. If you are doing it for people's response, if you are doing it for some element of self-gratification, in the end, it will lead you to despair. But if you do it for Jesus, you finish up on a Sunday, you leave the results to Him, and that's the only way you're going to be able to stay healthy through the process. But you put yourself out there week after week, and it is hard to do. I've been doing it for 30 years, and it wears you out. One of the things that I did early on is because of where I went to seminary and because of the models that I had, I took a verse-by-verse approach and expository preaching. And one of the things that I realized over time was we had a lot of hit and miss attendance. And so I would be assuming, for example, that people were going to be there every week in their seats listening breathlessly as they have heard me speak the week before, and everything would kind of follow after the previous message. And for example, I went through the Gospel of Luke, took 73 weeks and 51 weeks in Genesis. And so I did all that, but I realized that it was very difficult with the kind of situation we had, as fluid and as much as people would come and go, that it was very difficult to preach that way. And so I continued at times to preach out of portions of the Bible, and I do series, but I would probably be described today as a topical preacher. And one of the things that I struggled with is that there were people that would look at that and say, well, that is not biblical. And one of the things that as I read the New Testament, I realized is that there is no such thing as a quote unquote biblical way to preach. I can't think of one sermon in the New Testament that is expository in the way that I preached, that it was comparable to the way that I preached when I first got to Utah. It seems like when Jesus spoke, he talked about topics. He talked about different things. He talked about relationships. He talked about current events, and he applied the Old Testament to that. When we see the teaching of the apostles, they are often big picture sermons where they give people an idea of worldview. Yeah, so it's like there is no one way to preach, but we are preaching to a Latter-day Saint context. And I would say that one of the impacts that has had on me is that I probably preach on theology more than I would if I were in other places. I feel like it is important to talk about the doctrine of the Trinity, the doctrine of salvation, the Lordship of Christ. We spend a lot of time making sure that our people understand doctrine. And then beyond that, I'm trying to find themes that every human being can relate to. One of the last things that I do before I get up and preach, I read through my message one more time and I put a filter on and I say, okay, I think about somebody in our church that might be new to our church from the LDS church, and I say, how are they going to hear this? And I think that's an important thing to do. How is this individual going to hear this? And because what I want, I'm preaching for life change. I'm preaching so that their worldview can change. And we are trying to bring that person to a relationship where they place their faith in the Christ of the Bible. And so what is the most effective way that I can communicate that to the people that we're trying to reach?